With the 2022 NBA trade deadline just 1 week away, I wanted to take a look at some trades that you guys sent me, as well as some that I've created myself. First up on the list is a trade that I came up with myself, and it is Kendrick Nunn, Talen Horton-Tucker, and a first-round pick going to the Rockets in exchange for Eric Gordon going to the LA Lakers. This specific trade package is something that has been thrown around a lot of different places. Reportedly the Lakers have asked every team in the league what they'd be willing to give up in exchange for this package, and apparently the offers and the excitement has just not really been there for LA, and I don't really blame other teams. I don't know that Kendrick Nunn is really an asset at the moment. Talen Horton-Tucker is looking like one of the biggest offseason mistakes for the Lakers in years, especially when you compare it to possibly bringing back Alex Caruso. And then you do have that future first-round pick, but ultimately, if you're Houston, this is what it would come down to. Eric Gordon is a good player. I think there's going to be some interest for him. However, given the fact that he still has a couple years left on his contract and he has had some durability issues in the past, getting a first-round pick in exchange for him might be the best that you could do. Maybe there's another team out there that is willing to jump ahead of this Lakers offer if they find out this is all that it takes to get Eric Gordon. But he's not someone that's a part of the future plans of your roster. He's not someone whose value is going to increase over the next couple of seasons if you keep him past this deadline. And quite frankly, you have a ton of other guards, a ton of other young guys you should be playing over Eric Gordon. And so I don't really care about the players here. They're here to make the salaries match. But if you can get a first-round pick in exchange for Eric Gordon, I think that's a pretty good move. And for LA, this is really good value. Again, it would just come down to kind of what other teams would be interested in offering in exchange for Gordon, but he gives you shooting, he gives you perimeter creation. He's a bigger, stronger guy that might not be outstanding defensively at this point in his career, but he's going to give good effort. He's going to try, and he's not going to be a huge negative on that end of the floor, certainly. And this would basically be in place of what they tried to do with Buddy Hield in the offseason, and would be a huge, huge help to this Lakers team. This is a move that if you told the Lakers they could make this happen right now, they 100% would do it. It might not be incredible compensation in exchange for Eric Gordon. And if you're a Rockets fan, you're thinking, we can get more than this. You might be right, but ultimately, I think this is a decent deal for both sides. Next up, Taylor sends us a trade in which the Wizards get Domantas Sabonis and the Pacers get Kyle Kuzma, Deni Avdija, and a 2024 first-round pick from Washington. Sabonis in Washington is very interesting because they have this like three-headed monster at the 5 spot, and presumably Sabonis would be someone that would be playing at the 5 moving forward. And the majority of the reason why he plays at the 4 a little bit in Indiana is simply because he plays alongside Miles Turner. So then you're looking at Daniel Gafford and Thomas Bryant, Montrezl Harrell still being there potentially, and what that means for that Washington front court. And you're giving up Kuzma, who's been shockingly good. I think Deni has some upside, and the future first-round pick as well. Now, this is a move, though, that it seemed like Washington would make if they're just really concerned about Bradley Beal. If they don't want to move Bradley Beal, but they really need to give him a legitimate running mate in the front court, a legitimate front court scorer, this would absolutely be a move that I think Washington would take a look at making if they're a little bit nervous about Beal possibly leaving and the fact that they really need to have a good season. You got Dinwiddie, Beal, Sabonis. That's good enough to be a playoff team for the foreseeable future, and you do still have some flexibility moving forward in terms of cap space and things like that, to where Sabonis would be a pretty interesting addition to this group. I'm unsure about the fit, but strictly from a talent play, I think it makes a decent amount of sense. Meanwhile, for Indiana, the trade packages for Sabonis are all over the place, but Kuzma's a good player. I think Deni has a decent future, and you get the future first as well. Maybe you'd like to have a real focal point asset here apart from Kyle Kuzma and Deni, or you'd like to have multiple future first-round picks in exchange for Sabonis. But at the end of the day, this Pacers team just isn't very good, and sometimes you just need to make a move, and you need to just move some pieces around. And maybe this is the piece that ends up really freeing up this roster. We've got Kuzma playing alongside Turner in the front court. Deni turns into something. You use this future first down the road. There's a pretty solid amount of compensation in exchange for Sabonis. My last point here about this trade, thank you, Taylor, for sending it in, is if Washington does this and they give up some young assets and they get Sabonis, and then Bradley Beal leaves in the offseason, it is a complete and utter disaster. So without knowing that he's going to be back, it's a huge, huge risk. I honestly think that it would probably be better suited to just look at moving Beal at the deadline this year, as we talked about in the previous video earlier this week, but still, I appreciate you sending it in. Thank you. Next up, we have the Minnesota Timberwolves acquiring Jeremy Grant in exchange for Malik Beasley, Josh Okogie, and a top 10 protected first-round pick in this upcoming draft. So for Detroit, basically what this comes down to is there's a lot of Jeremy Grant interest out there. There's a lot of offers out there, but ultimately there might not be as many teams really advocating to bring him in as you might think, for two reasons. One, a lot of teams that want to bring in Jeremy Grant, including Minnesota, they want role player Jeremy Grant. They appreciate the fact that he's a better scorer now, a better offensive player, a better shooter. But a lot of these teams, Atlanta, Minnesota, they have perimeter guys. They have scoring. They need a defender. They need a rebounder. They need a rim protector and someone that can space off the ball and be a good offensive option. And there's concerns about whether Jeremy Grant's going to want to go back to that, and the fact that he's going to be looking for an extension relatively soon as well. But the extension point is one of the reasons why Detroit might be willing to go ahead and move him, even if it's just quote unquote in exchange for a package like this. I think Beasley has a decently bright future moving forward. It's just been a really tough season for him in terms of statistical production, in terms of efficiency. There's a little bit of potential still there for Okogie, and then you get this future first round pick. Maybe you end up with the 12th, the 13th, 14th, somewhere in the teens pick to continue to add assets there in Detroit, a team that has a handful of decent young players. Meanwhile, for Minnesota, you're really trying to push for the playoffs. You're basically swapping out Beasley's spot in the rotation with Jeremy Grant, which is a significant upgrade, assuming Grant comes back and is healthy. You do have to contend with what are you going to do on the extension for Grant. Detroit, I'm sure, is happy to get out of that situation to get assets in exchange for a guy that they just signed in free agency last offseason or 2 off seasons ago. But ultimately, I think the fit makes sense for Minnesota and for Detroit. If the other offers aren't as exciting as we might think that they would be right now in exchange for Jeremy Grant, I would take a look at this one. Second to last now, RK sends us a trade in which the Sixers get Domantas Sabonis and Caris LeVert in exchange for Ben Simmons to the Indiana Pacers. So first, we had to talk about the Sabonis Embiid fit here. I certainly have questions about how that would work. Defensively, they'd probably be able to make it happen because of how good Embiid is on that end of the floor. Offensively, there might be some limited spacing there, but they would destroy teams on the offensive glass. They would destroy teams in the paint and in the post, and it'd be almost impossible to switch against these guys. If you switched a small onto either one of these players, they're going to absolutely destroy that matchup. And that's a pretty devastating front court combination to think about. And you get a perimeter creator in Caris LeVert that I think his value has certainly gone down a little bit over the last year and a half or so, but he's still someone that helps you as a perimeter creator. And in place of getting an elite guy in exchange for Ben Simmons, this is a pretty decent package. Meanwhile, for Indiana, it's just a talent play. You hope that Ben Simmons is happy in Indiana, that it's a situation that he wants to be in. You give up Sabonis and LeVert. You don't have to give up any picks. You don't have to give up any players you recently drafted. You can just move forward with him and try and build whatever team he wants around him that you think would be successful. The big question would just be, if he's unhappy in Philly, would he be happy suddenly in Indiana? Or does he want to go to a California team? Does he want to be on a team that has a little bit more star power, is maybe a little bit better suited for him as a player? But strictly from a basketball fit, it's pretty much a blank slate there in Indiana, especially if you move Sabonis out of there. I think it's an interesting fit for him. Ultimately, I don't love the deal overall, because of the Sabonis and Embiid fit, as devastating as it would be at times. There would be some clunky fits there, and it just seems like Philadelphia wants to wait around on this. They want to wait until the offseason. They want to try and get James Harden. They want to try and make a star-type move in exchange for Simmons, and even if that does mean, as we've talked about in previous videos, basically giving up on an awesome Embiid season, seems like there's something they're relatively willing to do, but thank you again for sending it in. And then last up from Culture, we have another Jeremy Grant trade. In this one, the Mavs get Corey Joseph and Jeremy Grant in exchange for Maxi Kleber, Josh Green, Dwight Powell, a second, and a future first. For Detroit, you could argue this package is better than what they got in exchange for Jeremy Grant and the previous Minnesota trade, depending on what you think about Josh Green's future and or the ability of Dallas to still be a really good team potentially in 2025. But Dallas, I think, primarily is the team to talk about here, depending on the health of the rest of the roster, guys like Tim Hardaway Jr. Jeremy Grant could be a really, really cool fit. What really intrigues me is his fit alongside Kristaps Porzingis in the front court, where if we go back to semi-role player Jeremy Grant, he's a rim protector in addition to a wing defender. That really helps that fit alongside KP. They can go more towards some of these KP at the 5 lineups where it's, you could do Doncic, Hardaway Jr., whoever, KP, and Jeremy Grant, maybe throw Jalen Brunson in there. And that's suddenly a really devastating offensive lineup with the potential, depending on how Porzingis and Grant fit defensively, to be good on that end of the floor as well. And I know that Dallas has found some success lately, especially with 2 big lineups and playing guys like Dwight Powell alongside KP. But from a versatility standpoint, once you get in the postseason, and from an upside standpoint, I think they're a better basketball team if they have Jeremy Grant. And the price is not crazy here, especially given the fact that they're relatively limited in terms of their ability to bring in another big-time player to this roster. If you can get someone that fits the way that Jeremy Grant does in exchange for basically some contracts, one interesting young player in Josh Green, and one future first, I think that's absolutely a move to take a look at. And for Detroit, similar to what we talked about earlier, it just depends on what kind of value, what kind of offers they're getting in exchange for Jeremy Grant around the league. But it's certainly going to be a situation to continue to monitor, because I think they'd like to move Grant. It just depends on what role he's going to play and what role the extension ultimately plays in the trade talks for them as well as for other teams. And that's the end of the video. Thank you guys for sending in the trades. Hopefully we get a really cool next couple of days as we lead up to the trade deadline.